يا ابني ما صورتهم هم. طيب حاضر يا باشا. اوكي.
Years ago, mass protests erupted in Egypt that led to the downfall of Hosni Mubarak. Ahead of today's anniversary of the uprising, new clashes have broken out in Cairo, this time against the country's first freely elected leader. Police used tear gas against protesters as activists accused President Mohamed Morsi of betraying the goals of the uprising. Political uncertainty and an economic crisis have undermined support for the country's transition. And Morsi's been accused of failing to deliver on election promises. Security issues and fuel and food shortages still frustrate many Egyptians. Further mass protests are expected across the country later today. Morsi's opponents have called for large rallies in Tahrir Square.
Morsi, get out, shout the demonstrators. These empty tear gas canisters and spent ammunition are the debris from running battles with police the night before. It's the anniversary of the uprising that ousted Hosni Mubarak from decades in power, but his successor is just as unpopular. President Morsi is facing calls for the demands of the revolution to be realized. We went down into the streets to cast our votes, but we made a mistake and a bad choice. Our revolution isn't about destruction. The revolution will make Egypt and its generations happy. Our demands are dignity, humanity and a proper salary. We don't need to live in villas. Morsi's opponents claim that the Muslim Brotherhood, which propelled his rise to power, has betrayed them. The Arab Spring brought hope to many Egyptians, but for just as many others, real change and democracy are still tantalizingly out of reach.
A splinter movement has broken away from the Al-Qaeda-linked Islamists of Mali, saying it wants to fight terrorism and extremism. The newly formed group has stated it's ready for peace talks with the government and the French, whose forces are currently fighting there. France's defence minister, meanwhile, has said his country is prepared for a long conflict. RT's Maria Fanoshina looks at the reasons behind the French intervention.
The French have dived headlong into their military operation in Mali, but the discussion is still ongoing as to exactly why the Western nation has put boots on African soil, again costing money and people's lives. Official rhetoric remains in line with the mantra of war on terrorism, but some statements suggest another layer. France's defense minister has declared total reconquest of Mali is the main goal, with the president echoing French troops, 2,500 so far, will remain in the region for as long as necessary.
They're attempting to militarise huge sections of Africa so they're able to monopolise the access to the resources that are there. We're seeing this with AFRICOM specifically in relation to the United States, and now we're seeing it with France and other parts of the European Union through European Union troops actually being used in some of the Mali conflict as well, which has been relatively rare in the past.
Gold and especially uranium deposits make the country very attractive. Nearly 80% of all France's energy, generated by almost 60 nuclear power plants, is dependent on African uranium.
French companies must go on the offensive and fight the growing influence of rival China for a stake in Africa's increasingly competitive markets.
This is neo-colonialism, but with S in plural. France is far from the only nation to have and defend its interests in Africa.
The French have intervened around 50 times in Africa in the last 50 years since official decolonization, protecting regimes from rebels like in Djibouti or the Central African Republic, or fighting regimes like...
우리가 계속 발사하게 될 여러 가지 위성과 장거리 로켓도, 우리가 진행할 높은 수준의 핵시험도 우리민의 절천지 원수인 미국을 겨냥하게 된다는 것을 숨기지 않는다.
It's fighting talk again from North Korea, who say they will attack its neighbour and rival South Korea if Seoul joined a new round of tightened UN sanctions issued in response to the North's continued use of rocket and nuclear testing. This broadcast on state TV goes one step further, and this broadcaster said, if the puppet group of traitors takes a direct part in the UN sanctions, the DPRK will take strong physical countermeasures against it. The US envoy on South Korea policy, seen here arriving in Beijing on the second leg of his three-nation Asia tour, is in high-level talks aimed at discussing follow-up actions on the rapidly developing situation on the Korean peninsula. He is expected to release a statement later on today. I am Anne Salter, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the very latest news and updates with me at ibtimes.co.uk.
snow that you're looking at here on 279 North yesterday and then on 279 slowed down hundreds of drivers last night, including me. I was really surprised by it because it kind of came out of nowhere. There were no snow at all, and then suddenly it was like a blizzard. But I thought, okay, well, it's a typical January evening.
Yeah, but it wasn't. We were talking with folks at the National Weather Service in Pittsburgh today, and you're right, it was snow. It was lake effect snow. Typically, the lake effect snow, though, would generate from Lake Erie. This was an extremely unusual event because it started at the Beaver Valley Nuclear Power Plant.
It was kind of a man-made lake plume. It's almost like having a mini Lake Erie right up there over Beaver Valley. Same sort of effect. We've probably had it every time we have a strong Arctic outbreak.
Yeah, that's meteorologist Rich Kane with the National Weather Service in Pittsburgh. He picked up on this last night looking at the Doppler radar images, so I went back this afternoon and pulled some data. This is a Storm Tracker Doppler 11 radar image from 7:44 last night. You can clearly see the little thin lake effect band. It's about 2 miles north to south, 30 miles west to east. The Midland or shipping port plant, the Beaver Valley Nuclear Plant, is here, and what happened basically was a lake effect snow event. We had warm, moist air rising from the cooling towers. That air estimated to be about 90 to 95 degrees. That, of course, going into the Arctic cold air, and it produced a band of snow which was carried by the west to east wind, and it ended up falling across the Wexford-Gibsonia area, and estimates were about 1 inch to 2 inches. Lots of folks caught in it, including Peggy, and hopefully you made it home safely last night. A very unique snow event akin to a lake effect snow event that we would get here.
My name is Rich Kane. I'm the meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service here in Pittsburgh. Well, what we had is actually a plume of snow that actually came off the cooling towers from the Beaver Valley Nuclear Power Plant. What happens in the atmosphere when you have temperatures basically between about -4 Fahrenheit and about 14 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the section of the atmosphere where snow grows the best. And guess what? Our maximum temperature yesterday, I think, was about 13 degrees or so. Our minimum was 5 degrees. So that level was very near the surface of the Earth. If you put a moisture source and a heat source like the plume, like the warm moisture vapor from the cooling tower, instantaneously you form snow crystals, and you actually have a plume that streams off of that with the mean wind. And that's exactly what happened, as we can see from the radar yesterday.
So you're telling me this wasn't like something that could be predicted? This was a kind of a man-made thing that happened?
It was kind of a man-made lake plume. It's almost like having a mini Lake Erie right up there over Beaver Valley. Same sort of effect. We've probably had it every time we have a strong Arctic outbreak. Sometimes you never see it. Sometimes it occurs in different directions. All depends on the low-level winds and the speed and direction.
Yeah, so it was something like that, you know, people say, oh boy, how did the meteorologists, how did the weather people miss this? But it was nothing that they really would have known about.
No, it's a very localized too because of the moisture source. It's not like we have Lake Erie right next door. So it's a very localized type phenomenon that happens. So it is tough to say exactly where the plume is going to be, how strong the plume is going to be, how much moisture is going to fall. We figured we had a report of 1 inch of snow, but as cold as it was, that's very, very, very little liquid water. So it wasn't a whole lot of water. But of course, if that inch of snow falls on your sidewalk or the roadway, you know, it could make things hazardous.
Right. I know people who were stuck in traffic on 279, 79 and said it was almost like a whiteout. I mean, how far can that travel and how bad can it be?
Well, in this case, you had just the right conditions. They were optimal. So it actually, the plume was fairly large. It stretched from basically Beaver Valley Nuclear Power Plant all the way to the Westmoreland County line. Now, it wasn't, you know, a lot of snow underneath the entire plume, but areas, you know, picked up a fair amount of snow in a short period of time just from the plume itself. But again, really hard to predict because it's a very localized phenomenon. You just need just the right conditions to happen to get it.
How many times in a year around this area would you say that happens?
Well, we get on a typical year, we may have a couple of Arctic outbreaks, really cold air. When you look back, January 3rd, we had a high of 33 and a low of 5. But yesterday was only 13 and 5, so the real cold Arctic air was pretty shallow to the ground. That doesn't happen all the time. So maybe once or twice a year, we might get a good Arctic outbreak. And some years, we may not get any really good Arctic outbreaks. It all depends on the year of the season, and of course, the jet stream, how that flows, and how we get the good cold air out of Canada. But this could happen a couple of times a year. And again, it may not always be this extensive or be this visible because you have to have just those right conditions. Again, the colder the air that you put over a warm, moist source, it's just like lake effect, you can get more snow from that. So you really need just the right conditions.
So the source, the warm, moist source was like the stacks at the...
Was the cooling towers, the moist, warm air coming out of that. The atmosphere becomes buoyant. As it rises, it actually is in that preferred zone for temperature, and it goes right to snow crystals immediately. So again, it's just like a mini Lake Erie just upstream from you. So again, it doesn't happen all the time. It's fairly rare, but we've probably seen them before, but they probably weren't as visible and maybe produced that much snow.
So yesterday was kind of like a perfect storm for that to happen, and that was probably the worst, about as bad as it could get, right?
Yeah, and sometimes you get the conditions where you actually get true lake effect coming off the lakes, Erie and Huron, and maybe some of these small mini plumes from the towers could get mixed with that, and you can't tell which one's which. But yesterday was pretty good because it was the only thing happening there for the time, and it was the main player on the radar, and it was the main player putting down the snow that it did.
The hunt is on for thousands of crocodiles on the loose in northern South Africa. Up to 15,000 crocs made their bid for freedom when floods washed them into one of southern Africa's biggest rivers, the Limpopo, close to the border with Botswana. They were being bred at a reptile farm which sells crocodile skin to the fashion industry. Many of the crocodiles have been recaptured, but more than half are still on the run. One made it as far as a school rugby field 120 kilometers away. Heavy rains and flooding have claimed at least 20 lives in South Africa and neighbouring Mozambique and led to thousands being evacuated from their homes.
north is being hit by heavy rain and damaging winds as an ex-cyclone and a monsoon trough threaten widespread flooding. Cyclone Oswald crossed the coast at around 1 o'clock this morning south of Weipa. It became a tropical low shortly after, but not before dumping hundreds of millimetres of rain.
Oswald arrived with 100-kilometre-an-hour winds and torrential rain. The town of Weipa was having its driest summer in almost 20 years, until now.
We've probably had between 12 and 15 inches of rain since Friday. It's a large swimming pool at the moment.
Even as the cyclone was downgraded to a tropical low, it packed enough power to bring down trees and power lines. Emergency crews left Cairns this morning for the Gulf, where hundreds of people are cut off and without power.
There'll be tough conditions. There are flooding issues on the Cape at places like Arakoon, and obviously the government will be responding to assist those communities any way we can.
2 remote airstrips are washed out.
We're covering at the moment, obviously, for medical evacuations and so forth, but these communities the remote communities are always isolated during this time of the year and really rely on the airstrips.
The system continues to move slowly east across the Cape and is expected to head south from tomorrow morning, bringing more rain to the east coast, already being drenched by a monsoon trough off Cairns.
Anywhere north of Rockhampton could see some further heavy rain on and off over the next few days.
Last night, most of the rain fell over the Cassowary coast. A tourist took these pictures at Paranella Park, a popular tourist attraction, even more popular now.
Mother Nature at her finest, and yeah, it's amazing.
It's the most rain they've seen here since Yasi.
It's really our lifeblood. This is the water that flows and produces our electricity.